So welcome to the November installment of the University of Idaho, Utah State University, and South Dakota State University Sheep and Goat webinar. We do this every second Wednesday of the month, and we are excited to have you here today. I am Melinda Ellison, University of Idaho sheep specialist, and Carmen Wilmore is my counterpart in Idaho who works alongside me on this webinar with goats. We also have Chad Page from Utah State University, who's the sheep and goat specialist. And we have Jalen Whaley, who's with South Dakota State University as a regional sheep specialist. And then last but not least, and only last because she's also our speaker today, is Kelly Froelich, and she is with South Dakota State as well. And she's your small ruminant specialist there. So today she's going to visit with us about dewormers and fecal egg counts. And although sometimes it is more timely in the summer and early fall, it's also for some people timely now. So we decided to go ahead and give it a cover. And so Kelly, thank you so much for joining us and sharing this information with us. And I'll let you take it from here.
Okay. Well, thank you, Melinda. So thank you everyone for tuning in. So just a little bit of background on me. In my PhD, I did a little bit of parasite work. So, I'll just put the disclaimer out there. Like, I don't consider myself a parasitologist, but that's where I kind of learned the bulk of my information. And then also just, raising sheep and being an extension specialist and working with producers. So just to kind of like start off this presentation, I just kind of wanted to introduce like internal parasites. In the sheep world and in the goat world, there's a lot of different parasites, and I'm definitely not going to cover all of them. But when we talk about, internal parasites, we can kind of classify them into multicellular or like a single cell. So like our single cell, like protozoa kind of parasites that we think of. So the most common one would be like Coccidia. On the multicellular level, we can kind of split that down even further into a couple different groups. And this is not, by any means all inclusive, but nematodes or roundworms, cestodes, which would be like your tapeworms, flatworms, and lastly, like your trematodes, like flukes, right? So for this presentation, I'm mostly just going to be focusing on nematodes because that's the one that we consider probably the most problematic, US wide, right? So we'll just go ahead with that one. I first wanted to kind of just kick off with just a little bit of basic, I guess, biology, because sometimes, you hear like vets or other producers, kind of using terms interchangeably. So like sometimes you'll hear nematodes, sometimes you'll hear roundworms. Usually it's referring to the same thing. Sometimes you might even hear like a vet talking about how you have like strongles or something like that. So if you think back to like middle school or high school biology class, and think about, the classification on how we name different things. So on the right, I have, just kind of that classification system that I'm talking about. So nematodes is basically the phylum, right? And if we were to narrow that down, the family name is, strongles, right? So that's just kind of, like, if you're to think about it, usually when we're talking parasites in sheep or goats, it's all kind of referring to the same thing. But I just kind of wanted to point that out there. If you ever, hear different things and you're kind of confused about, what people are exactly talking about, that's kind of what they're talking about. So when we talk about nematodes, there's three that we really kind of, I guess, are of most concern with sheep and goats. And so this would be, the species. So Homunculus contortus. So this is just known as the barber pole worm, Trichostrongylus calibriformis, which is the black scour worm, and then Telodorsagia circumcincia, the brown stomach worm, right? So these are kind of, when we talk about, nematodes, these are kind of the three that always get the most amount of attention, the ones that kind of have a lot of focus on them. So I'm not going to talk about every single one of these because we could spend a long time talking about different worms, right? But I am going to point out the Homunculus contortus one. So you might have heard this if you have sheep and goats. This is the one that kind of gets a lot of attention all the time. And that's just simply the barber pole worm. So this is kind of considered one of the most problematic covalent worms. And basically how this worm has its name, like I don't have a good full picture, of a worm zoomed up, but if you were to look at a microscope, it kind of has that like circular, like spiral that you would see on a barber pole. So that's why it kind of has a name. And it also has, like, at the end of it, this nice little spike, right? With that spike, they can do a lot of damage, in a sheep or goat abomasum. So basically, when the sheep or goats, get this worm, they live in the mucosal layer of the abomasum. And basically, what they do with that little barb is they actually cut little, like, scratches, so to speak, in the lining of the stomach, which causes that damage, and they feed off of the blood that comes from those little cuts. So this causes, high mortality and morbidity in both our sheep and goats. So this is just kind of like some average statistics of an average worm. So an average worm sucks about 0.05 mils of blood a day, which doesn't seem like a lot, but those female worms also lay about 5,000 eggs per day. So if you figure, and this is just rough math, that if you have an animal that has 300 female worms, that's 15 milliliters of blood per day that those 300 worms are eating. And they're also, on top of that, laying about 1.5 million eggs per day. So you can see, even with a kind of a smaller infection, how that infection can become a lot greater problem, if it's not treated appropriately, right? So, and I don't know how well you can see this on your screen. This picture here, this is just a picture from my PhD program where we kind of artificially infected lambs with about 5,000 Homunculus catortis worms. So this is just kind of the lining of the abomasum, and all of these little red kind of stringy looking things, those are the worms, right? So these worms, you can't really see their eggs in the feces or anything. And you can sort of, I guess, see it, if you open the animal up and we wash the abomasum. But for the most part, like, as you can kind of see from the picture, they're pretty small. So it's pretty hard to tell, if the, animal has an infection unless there's other symptoms, or if you're looking at, their manure and looking for fecal eggs. So we all kind of know, and you're all probably here because we know parasitism is a problem, right? So there's been documented resistance to every type of dewormer that we have, and there's nothing really new coming down the pipeline, right? So I think the last approved dewormer was ivermectin, which that was approved before I was born, just to kind of like give you an idea of, we haven't had anything new for a long time, especially in the US. In goats, it's a huge problem, as well as sheep, but I put in the goat statistics just because, they have an even bigger problem, but it's estimated about 25%, or almost 1 in 4 deaths are due to non-predator or due to internal parasites. So, and what we know is that parasite animals require, a lot of extra nutrients, right? So a lot of times what we see, as symptoms in the animals is just kind of the top of the iceberg, right? There's a whole bunch of other stuff underneath the surface that, can cause problems. So it's pretty important that, when we're treating animals with parasites or looking at, if we have parasite problems, that we have a recognition that it is, it quite detrimentally affects our animals. So what we know, is that when animals have high parasite loads, is that they're going to require a lot of extra nutrients, especially protein, especially if you have like things like the barber pole worm that's going to be, eating a lot of the blood. So, and this is all, as we all kind of know, nutrition is very important for animals. And if that's being robbed by something, even if we have a diet that's formulated for our animals, they could still be, on the side of things of not getting enough, which is overall going to affect their productivity. Sorry, having trouble speaking today. So parasitism. So when we talk about internal parasites, it depends on the worm species, but there's a lot of different symptoms that can occur. So clinical is just meaning that these are symptoms that can be seen. So usually with, sheep or goat, if you're not paying attention, or if it's kind of a sneaky worm, sudden death can definitely be kind of on the extreme end, but can happen, right? Some other clinical symptoms might be anemia, so diarrhea, just overall weakness. Sometimes you can get, depending on the worm species, bottle jaw, and that's just where like the underside of the jaw kind of gets swollen. And that just has to do with like an imbalance in the fluid in the animal from those parasites robbing nutrients. And subclinical, so these are all of the things that we can't necessarily see unless you're maybe measuring it, right? So this is going to be the part that's kind of under the water part of the iceberg, right? So potentially, if they're not feeling well, they might not be eating well. They might have reduced weaning weight, affects their reproduction, milk production, growth rate, increases susceptibility to other diseases just from the standpoint the animal's trying to fight off the infection of parasites. So when we look at parasites, one important aspect of understanding parasites is understanding the life cycle, right? This is pretty important to know, just to know how it affects the animal and when it affects the animal. So this is just a life cycle looking at Homunculus catortis, which is the barber worm, and this is pretty similar for a lot of the other types of roundworms and stuff that we get. So the black scour worm and the brown stomach worm. So this is starting off like when eggs are released in feces. So let's say you have an animal that has an active parasite infection. Those worms in there are mating. They're going to be releasing eggs, which is going to go out, into your pastures or barnyard or wherever as eggs. So those eggs kind of hatch into what we would call an L2 stage, which basically means they're just in a juvenile stage, right? And these L2 larvae, they will kind of stay in, usually a fecal pat, but they might move into the soil, and they're going to eat and kind of wait for conditions to, be able to hatch out. And then they come into a stage which we call L3, right? So L3 is what we consider the infective stage. And it's considered the infective stage because this is the stage that a sheep or a goat would consume, right? And then would help, kind of complete this life cycle. So in the L3 stage, it's important to note we have a pretty tough like sheath on them. So this is able to like protect them from the elements. And this is a pretty important part for the worm, just simply because, when it's in an L3 stage, get eaten by the sheep or goat, it has to crawl up the stems of grass, right? And that's how, they're going to get it ingested from the animal. And in the animal, will actually kind of molt that sheath off. And that's when they can kind of eat again and make that damage to the stomach lining that I was talking about. In the L3 stage, because it has that protective coating or sheath on it, like they're not consuming any nutrients during that time period. So kind of, between the L2, and that L4 stage, in between that time period, the worm is just kind of hanging out, right? Which also makes them really, really tough. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So worms are adapted to survive, right? So I talked about how the L3 worms, have that protective sheath on it, which means that they can survive, outdoors, indoors, even in winter, right? That whole purpose of that sheath is to keep them kind of, cozy or whatever until they can be consumed by an animal and become infective. So there are kind of ideal hatching temperatures for worms, and that's somewhere, above 50 degrees Fahrenheit and 80% humidity. But this is, it depends on the worm, and also depends, this is an average condition. Doesn't mean that, like, okay, if these conditions aren't met, that they can't hatch out. It's just that these ones are the ideal conditions when you're going to have the most hatching, right? And then also an important kind of concept to understand is this hypobiosis, or arrested development. And this basically, once the worms molt from that L3 to L4 stage, this allows them to kind of survive within the animal. And this particular, what do I want to call it? Stage, it's thought to be kind of regulated by the host, right? So when a sheep or goat, they pick up all of those worms on pasture, at some point they're going to have a very large worm burden if, nothing changes and you have a pasture that is heavily infected and those worms have ideal conditions to mate and just keep doing their things, right? So arrested development happens, when the host, so the sheep or goat, they have an immune response to these worms. And basically that kind of signals to the worms that, okay, maybe you need to they kind of go on a period of where they're not very active, right? And kind of reactivate when they sense the immune system of the host, so of the sheep or goat, is kind of down, right? So typically what we see is, we have these animals grazing on pasture as we go into winter. The larvae in the animals go into this arrested development, and then they kind of pop up or reappear when the sheep or goat, lambs, or kids, right? Because the immune system's down. And this allows them to kind of overwinter, so to speak, in the animal. And it's also, kind of a process that these worms have evolved to be able to survive, and not be killed out. So typically when we see our peak worm burdens, and again, this is going to vary quite a bit, depending on where you are, but we'll see, kind of a peak worm burden in spring when, the sheep or goats are lambing or kidding. And then also again in midsummer in that July, August period. So when I talk about control of internal parasites, I kind of like to break it down into 3 different groups on what my, recommended strategy is. And this is simply making sure that you're treating your animals properly, minimizing parasite challenges. And then the last one is avoid overuse, kind of maintain refuge of your drugs to make sure that you're not getting a lot of animals that are resistant to your different dewormers. So I'll talk about each of these a little bit more in depth. So the first one, when I talk about treating your animals properly. So first of all, it's important to know what kind of worms you're dealing with and, what kind of drench you're using, right? So different drenches, treat different types of worms. So if you're using a drench that does not treat the worms that you have, well, it's not going to help you much. So it's also important to use a proper dose, right? So this is in terms of, just making sure that your calculated dose is right. But then also too, maybe checking your drench gun is giving the intended dose that it's supposed to, right? So I'm, in the picture, they have just like a single, drench gun, but, if you have one of those ones that kind of repeatedly just fill it up, just check it every once in a while and make sure that it's giving the correct dose. So one thing that I always like to tell people, when it comes to dewormers, the worst thing you can do if you're going to treat your animals is to underdose your animals, right? And this is simply due to the fact that if you underdrench an animal and there is not enough drench there to kill the worms in that animal, you're going to develop, or you're going to have worms that, maybe get weakened, but then they're going to get stronger and they're going to have ability to create resistance against that drench because they've had just a little bit to weaken them, but then they can bounce back stronger than ever, right? So it's pretty important when you're using products that you're using products that you know are effective. So using products that are not expired, right? Because they can lose effectiveness over time. And also making sure that you're reading the drench labels, and properly storing it, right? I know I had a call, this was a year or so ago. Somebody left their drench in their vehicle and it froze, right? Well, you can't be guaranteed that drench is going to be effective anymore. So as much as I hated to say it, it's probably better that that producer goes out and buy new stuff than trying to unthaw that drench and hoping that it's going to work, right? I always like using oral drenches as well. If you think about it, all of the worms that are of most concern are in the gut of the animal, and that's kind of a direct shot to getting to those worms. And there's also quite a bit of research out there. Some of your injectables, your porons, they're maybe not as effective as some of your oral drenches are. So if you're kind of trying to combat resistance, definitely oral drenches, I feel like, are a better way to go. And then this last point, this seems pretty basic, but just making sure the drench is swallowed, right? So this is making sure that when you're putting the drench gun in there, it's over the back of the tongue, and it's, straight shot to the back of the mouth, right? If you have an animal that spits out your drench and only gets that partial dose, so like I was talking about earlier, if they're not getting a dose strong enough to kill those worms, you can have issues with, worms developing resistance, right? Most of our drenches have a pretty high safety margin. So if you do see an animal that, spits it out, or, it's better to re-drench those and re-drench that animal, making sure that it gets the dose that it needs. So when we talk about different classes of dewormers, so I talked about knowing the different types of wormers. You can kind of break those down into 3 different classes. So your white dewormers, your persistent dewormers, so your nicotinic agnostics. And these are just kind of, classifying, the different dewormers into the mode of action, so to speak, right? So you might have heard in the past, it used to be recommended that you switch dewormers, and that didn't do a lot of good for the industry, because what happened was that we had producers that, maybe switched dewormers, but it might have been, they switched dewormers, but it was the same brand, right? So like Valbazen or Safeguard, right? Those have the same mode of action, so it doesn't actually work to help combat any resistance, right? So it's no longer usually recommended to switch dewormers. It's better to use, one wormer until it stops working for you, and then hopefully then you have all of these other wormers that still work for your farm that can help you battle parasites. So when we talk about what drench you should use, definitely it should be a drench that is effective for your property. So again, making sure that the drench you're using is effective against the worms you have, making sure that that drench has a good efficacy, right? So if your efficacy of those dewormers, start decreasing, it's just kind of shooting yourself in the foot, and you're going to be building up that resistance, right? So some of the things that, like, if you do have resistance on your farm, and this is something you definitely should work with your vet on, but there's a couple different strategies that are out there that kind of work. So if you're using one brand of or one type of dewormer, that maybe you have to repeat the dosing, in a certain number of hours, afterwards, to making sure that if you're treating those animals, that you're killing all of the worms possible, so you're not building up that resistance. Another strategy is using 2 or more drench groups sequentially. So like, I talked about, I had that previous slide with those different types of dewormers with, different modes of action, right? So you can go not mixing dewormers, right? But go with, one dewormer, and then go again with the other dewormer, and that just making sure that you're wiping everything out. And then there's some thought out there that if you're using like persistent products, so on the previous slide, so like ivermectin, it has kind of a long acting ability that, that can help create some resistant issues as well. So my second point is just kind of minimizing parasite challenges, right? So keeping drench resistant worms from your property is pretty important. So if you're just starting out, it's not a bad, or well, not even if you're just starting out, if you're getting new animals in there, it's not a bad idea to drench all of those new animals and quarantine kind of after their treatment, right? So if you're doing a very good job managing your parasite, and then you bought in new sheep that comes from a farm that maybe didn't do a very good job, managing their dewormers. Depending on how many animals you have and how many animals you're bringing in, potentially if those new animals have resistance to a dewormer, you can introduce that to your farm, right? So, if you can drench them when you get them, that's a good way to kind of hopefully help minimize the resistance coming into your farm. And then quarantine after treatment. And I know this isn't, not everybody can do this, but it's important to remember when we deworm our animals, we're killing worms, not eggs, right? So you see a lot of times, or like I've seen some, articles and stuff like, oh, how when you deworm them, you should put them on clean pastures so they don't get reinfected. Well, our dewormers don't kill our eggs, right? And it's not going to be instantaneous where we deworm them and then the eggs are going to be gone, right? They're going to still come out a few days afterwards. So that's kind of important to kind of keep in mind. If you're trying to break, a parasite cycle, if you can, yard your animals or something after you deworm them, then hopefully, theoretically, those eggs should all be in the yard barn area. On minimizing parasite challenges, proper nutrition is also pretty important. If your animals aren't getting enough to eat, obviously that's going to affect their immune system, which means they're not going to have that immunity to kind of, combat the parasitism. And then also genetics. So there's a saying out there, 70% of your worms will be shed from 30% of the herd. So, and there is quite a bit of work being done in the Southeast with like hair sheep and Katahdins and stuff, developing kind of animals that are resistant to parasites. And then just there's other alternatives too to help minimize parasite challenges. I have a couple slides on those different things, and they all have their pros and cons. And most of them are kind of like, as you'll see, they're kind of expensive, and they do definitely have their negatives to them. But, for some people, they have been helping, as part of their parasite program. So I did put in here pasture considerations. So when we look at, if you think back to the life cycle that I showed you earlier, when you're grazing, it's pretty important to know the like auto infection period. So this is the period, like if you have ideal conditions that ideal conditions for hatching worms. So like if you treated an animal, you put them on pasture, within that 4 to 10 day period, if your conditions are right, you could have, reinfection of those animals if there's, eggs still persistent on the pasture. So that's kind of just important to know that like if you're looking at, different pasture management techniques to, I guess, minimize, parasites, that's one potential thing that you can kind of keep in mind if you're rotating stock. I kind of struggle a little bit because probably have also heard about, just rest time. So just time stock is not in pasture, and that kind of goes with the auto infection, the grazing period. And I struggle with this a little bit, just from the standpoint, when I talk to you about like those L3 larvae on pastures, they're pretty tough, right? So there's some mindset that like, okay, being in a northern climate in South Dakota where I'm at, that winter kind of kills off those worms. And that's not necessarily true, right? I kind of always go with the mindset that there's always going to be some parasites on your pasture, right? There is some research out there that switching stock can count, as a rest and kind of help break up that parasite cycle. So this is not switching stock between like sheep and goats, because sheep and goats have very similar parasites. But this is like switching like cows and sheep and goats or something like that, right? Because the parasites that are of important to cows are different than what's important to sheep or goats. So cows, they're going to ingest those L3 larvae, but they're not going to infect the cow. So then it kind of resets it, so to speak. And then the last point I always bring up is just pasture height, right? So if you're doing a good job managing your pasture, this should help, with those parasite problems, right? So on the right here, I just have, a rough, a little graphic here. But most worm larvae are within the first couple inches of a grass, right? So those L3 larvae I was telling you crawl up those grass stems, they don't go up very far, right? So if you're doing a good job managing your pastures and not overgrazing, you're going to be minimizing your chances of them, grazing a whole lot of larvae, right? And not necessarily minimizing everything. I'm not saying that, but is going to help minimize it. So when we talked about alternatives to treating animals for parasites, there's a couple different things on the market currently. So biowarma is one that has come up in the last few years. Some of the research from outside of the United States have shown that, it has reduced fecal egg counts by 86% in goats. So currently there is a group out on the eastern side of the United States doing some work on biowarma to get some US data. And maybe at some point when they're ready to share their information, we can invite them on and have more of a conversation about that. The disadvantage to this product, that it is a product that needs to be fed daily. So if you're truly a pasture-based system, and you're most likely not feeding your animals, hand feeding them daily, there is the question, okay, well, how would I get this product to them, right? And it's also pretty expensive. Should have looked this up. This price was from a couple years ago, so I don't know, it might have increased with inflation and everything else. But, last time I looked it up, it was 21 cents per animal per day. So if you have a lot of animals, that adds up quite quickly. Next, kind of alternative that's been on the market, copper oxide wire particles. So basically, it's just a capsule filled with, little tiny copper wire particles. When the animal ingests it, these little particles kind of get stuck into the abomasum wall, and this helps kind of kill off mature barber pole worms, right? The problem with this, as you all know, with sheep, copper toxicity, can be a concern, even to some extent goats if you get too much. And copper is one of those kind of weird ones that, it just builds up in the liver, right? Until it reaches a point that it becomes too much, right? So there is that concern with it. And then some other alternatives, and these ones are not actually available commercially or in the US. There's a a barber vax. This was developed, I think, by the Mordun University in Scotland. And it's a vaccine that reduces fecal egg counts of, again, the barber pole worm. Like I said, it's not available in the US, and I've heard kind of mixed reviews about it. Just from the standpoint, like you have to have multiple doses to gain immunity for this vaccine. And then I think you also have to kind of repeat it, right? So, depending on where you're at and what kind of system you have, if you have to handle your sheep or goats up to, potentially 3 times in a year, that could be, quite a bit and just unfeasible. There's another paper that I, saw that kind of came out in 2020 of looking at BP cristoproteins. This was pretty effective at reducing barber pole worms and parasite burdens, especially on female parasites. But this was kind of like an experimental thing, and there's not a commercial development, so to speak, on it that I know of at this point. So, but these are, something that I guess if you're interested in spending some time reading some things that, maybe you can dig in a little bit more on that. My last point when we talk about, kind of controlling parasites is just avoiding overuse and maintaining refuge with your dewormers. So I kind of said earlier, if you're treating your animals, the most important thing you can do is making sure that if you're going to treat that animal, that you're going to kill those worms, right? If you only partially kill the worms, or you have some that are, got a taste for the dewormer, but it weakened them, they're going to become resistant to those worms. And then if nobody's ever told you before, it's okay to not deworm animals, right? So if you are, one of these people that like you deworm 4 or 5 times in a year just because that's how it's always done, you're probably developing resistance to dewormers, right? So I stated earlier that, 70% of our worms come from 30% of our flock or herd, right? If we can have animals that have not been exposed to dewormers, that means that when they're breeding, and those animals ingest those parasites and they're breeding in the animals, hopefully then you're kind of mixing them and minimizing that resistance buildup, right? So treat only the animals that need it. I like to always tell people kind of use a 5-point check. And if you want like kind of a targeted goal is use 30% as untreated. And so when I talk about the 5-point check, this isn't going to be applicable to all parasites, but it's a good, reference check just, to determine the health of your animal, right? So when we talk about that 5-point check, so it can be, you're looking at the eyes, you're looking at body condition score, you're looking at fecal soiling on the back end, looking at the jaw for bottle jaw. You can be looking at the coat for goats, the nose for sheep. And this is just kind of an overall body check of your animals. And obviously, certain worms are going to have certain symptoms and some of not the other, right? I've heard a couple times from producers, talking about, so when we talk about 5-point check of the eye, that's referring to FAMACHA, and all it is you're looking at that inner eyelid, looking for anemia. Well, anemia can be a symptom of a lot of different things and doesn't necessarily, mean that it's going to be worm caused, but a lot of times, that's going to be the number one cause, right? And I've heard some people, they're like, oh, it's worthless, it doesn't tell you anything. Well, we got to remember that FAMACHA, so it was developed by a researcher in South Africa, that they developed it specifically to identify barber pole worms which consume blood, right? Some of your other worms are not going to have as much of an effect on causing anemia in the animals, right? So that's where other, symptoms, might be important to look at. So like your body condition score, right? If you have worms that are stealing a bunch of nutrients, but maybe not necessarily blood, it can reduce their body condition scoring. And so that's why, when I'm talking about parasites and doing a general parasite talk, it's important to kind of have, look at all of these different things and just do a general health assessment on how your animals are doing. So going into kind of wrapping that up, so fecal egg counts. So this can be a very good indication of, parasites, especially on your roundworms, nematodes. So it really does not have to be all that difficult. So some simple supplies, and you can kind of estimate, the number of eggs that your animals have and kind of give you an indication of parasite load. So some supplies, so obviously you're going to need a fecal sample, some sort of flotation solution. So you can buy flotation solutions online. I like to go the cheaper route, and I just use water with pickling salt, right? So it's, and here's just kind of like a basic recipe if you wanted to measure something out. I'll be honest, if I'm doing this, just for my like home use for my sheep flock, I don't measure it out. I usually just pour the salt in there until, mix it up, let it sit overnight. And generally when there is a layer of salt on the bottom, I know that solution is going to be saturated, and so it should work well. I would also point out that I always use pickling salt versus table salt, because table salt oftentimes has an anti-caking agent in there, so it might not mix very well with the water. So it might not get as saturated as you're wanting it to. And then just the other things that I usually use a tea strainer, and this is just simply after you mix the fecal sample with the flotation solution. I like to strain out just the bits of manure or, hay or whatever. Hopefully, you don't have a lot of hay, it's a pretty clean sample, and it just makes it easier to put it in the microscope slide. So basically, when you're doing this, it's the basic one is, you take 2 grams of fecal sample. You can measure that out on a scale. Otherwise, if you don't have a scale, if you take like 2 little round pellets, that's roughly a pellet is about a gram, right? The main thing when you're doing this, on home or on your farm, is that you're consistent in how you do it, right? So once that's been sitting, you strain out the manure fecal sample, you're going to need a microscope. So the microscope does not need to be very fancy. Most kids' microscopes, honestly, have enough depth or whatever you want to call it to look at eggs, because you only need about a 10x lens. And then what I use when I'm counting fecal egg counts, I use a McMaster slide, and these are available. So on the slide, it has that fecsource.com. You can buy it from there. You can buy it from Amazon. There's a couple different places to go. But once you have kind of your fecal solution, you're just going to be using a pipette, and you're just inserting and filling up these little chambers on the slide. So these slides kind of has a bottom and a top, and there's a little gap in between. And these, where my mouse is where all that liquid is going to go. And you're just counting the number of eggs in this blue square with these lines, right? And you're doing it on both sides. So basically what you're looking for under the microscope is just parasite eggs. So this is a picture that I kind of borrowed from a book. When we're looking at our nematodes or roundworms, whatever you want to call it, this is the shape that we're kind of looking for. And I wouldn't worry too much about identifying, the different types of worms, because to be honest, it's really hard to identify differences, in types of worms under a microscope without kind of incubating those worms and getting the actual worms. So your roundworms, they're all kind of, oval shape like this. You might see some smaller little worms like up here in the left-hand corner of this picture. So those are just different types of coccidia. And typically we do not count those as part of our fecal sample because they have a whole different way of treating and everything else. You know, that's not going to be treated with wormer, right? Most of these other ones might get some pneumodiarrhea in your samples, depending on where you're at. And those are really large eggs. And again, those are going to be, you know, different, certain types of dewormer are going to be treating that one. And the other common one you might see is tapeworm, which is kind of like a triangle shaped worm like this. But basically what we're looking for is these kind of oval shaped worms like that. So when you were looking under a microscope, what does this look like? So this is just a McMaster slide that is under a microscope. So this is just, you know, the blue lines, you know, on those little square pieces. In this picture, all of these, you know, dark dots like this, those are just bubbles, right? So we're not concerned about those. We're not going to be counting those. But what we're looking for is the round oval worms. So if you look on this picture, there's two different oval shaped worms, or I keep calling them worms, eggs on these slides. So there's one up here where my mouse is pointing, one down here. So if I were to count this, that would be 2 eggs, right? And there's a little tiny egg right down there. That's a coccidia egg, so that would not be included. So if we were to zoom up on this, so this dark bubble, dark little round circle, that's the bubble, right? So we wouldn't count that, but we would be counting this round oval shaped worm. This smaller one is a coccidia egg. So like under a microscope, you can kind of, you know, pretty clearly tell the difference between, you know, coccidia egg and a nematode egg just by the size. And I know it's kind of, I'm blabbing on about this and it's, you know, hard to do on a PowerPoint, right? But that's kind of basically what you're looking for in these McMaster slides. So what you would do on those slides is basically, you know, I showed you, I should have put a picture on here. I'll go back to this one. So these slides, you're counting all of the eggs within this square box, right? Typically, when I'm looking through a microscope, I'm going to start on one of these horizontal, like little columns, right? And I'm just going to read it going from up or down and then going up and down, back and forth like that until I have read that entire box, right? And so once you get that, and you do both chambers, you're going to add up all of those eggs that you counted, and you're actually going to multiply it by 50. So this multiplication factor is specific to the number of feces that you put in the flotation solution. And don't worry if you're like, I'm never going to remember that, right? If you buy like the McMaster slides, they always come with like a little sheet that tells you how to calculate those out. All this means is that one of those eggs represents, you know, 50 eggs per gram of feces, right? Because we have to figure that, you know, we're taking a small subset of the feces, right? So that's why there's a multiplication factor. Sometimes you will see, you know, like 4 grams of feces used to 26 mils of flotation solution. That changes your multiplication factor. So then, you know, 1 egg represents 25 grams or 25 eggs per gram of feces, right? So the main thing to do is just kind of follow the directions, you know, and know that if you're doing 2 grams or 4 grams, that's going to change the amount of, you know, eggs per milliliter of flotation solution. So that's going to change that multiplication factor. So one way, like if you were willing and wanting to do this on the farm, and determine your efficacy of different dewormers. You could do this by taking a fecal sample before you dewormed your animal. And then once you dewormed your animal, you're going to wait a certain amount of days depending on the type of dewormer that you're using. And then you're going to take another fecal sample, right? And you're going to look at basically the difference in those two samples, right? So sample one on this right-hand side is the number of eggs per gram of feces that you calculated before you dewormed. And then sample two is what your eggs per gram of feces would be after you deworm. You're finding the difference. You're dividing that by your first sample, right? Timesing it by 100, get your percent that got killed, right? And that would give you a rough estimate on the efficacy of your dewormer, you know, and if it's going well for your farm. So you can see from this little table, they did 3 different samples. So they got 90%, 84%, 82%, and then you're going to take an average of that to find an average percent kill for your sheep, flock or goat herd, right? So typically, you know, you want an average of 95% or greater. The better that it is, the better your efficacy, and that's a good thing, right? But the main thing is, you know, work with your vet to kind of come up with that parasite plan. And if you see that efficacy kind of being reduced, then maybe you need to change things up or, you know, do something different to make sure that, you know, all of your animals, when you're treating them, is getting that treatment that's going to be effective for them. What is that? Oops. Okay. Okay. My PowerPoint slide jumping around a little bit, but that's kind of all I had for today. But is there any questions on, I know that was a lot of information kind of all at once. I'm sorry about that. But is there any questions from the audience?
There are several questions, so we'll kind of just get jumping in. The very first one is, can you touch a little bit on deworming and stage of pregnancy for our listeners?
Yep. So they're typically, okay. So most dewormers, like obviously the most important thing is read the label, right? So most dewormers, you know, they are safe for using on pregnant animals. There's some dewormers like, okay, your valbazen, you know, it has a, you know, something in the, you can only use it like in the last part of pregnancy, right? If it's earlier in pregnancy, that can cause some issues with fetal development and that sort of thing. So the most important thing is read the label. If you're still not sure, you know, go talk to your vet, right? Because they will have all of that information. So.
Perfect. And then just a little bit more depth, and you may or may not have the information handy in your brain, but can you talk a little bit about grazing different species together, and if there's a certain way that you can do it that's better, whether it's horses and sheep or cattle and sheep or goats and sheep? I don't know if you have any more specifics on that.
Yeah. Well, I guess just from like everything that I've read and stuff. So like I kind of mentioned, like sheep and goats, the parasites that are most problematic for both sheep and goats are similar. So, you know, switching stocks between them is not going to do anything, right? Because it's the same parasites. I don't know about horses, I guess. I'm not a horse person. Sorry, but there is the thought process that like if you switch your sheep or goat herd with like cows, that could help break up that parasite cycle a little bit, just because the cows, they'll ingest, you know, those L3 larvae on the pasture that the sheep and goats would drop, right? But it's just going to pass through them. It's not going to be infective for the cow. So there's, I don't know. It's kind of all I know on the topic without digging into it further. But I don't know, Melinda, if you had anything else to add to that you knew of, but
Yeah, I think we could actually touch on that one of these days, maybe towards spring, because there's a lot of different ways that you can graze different species of animals that you're either targeting one of them because you have a parasite problem specifically, or but there's different objectives, I guess. And so when you're thinking about parasite control in the animals versus managing the parasites on the pasture and that type of thing. So I think we'll try and touch on that before we get into the grazing season. I'm with you. I'd have to do a little digging to make sure I really could give the best answer to that. Um, so I guess thinking about the fecal egg count and looking at that, do you have any recommendations for the best timing, seasonality, or stage of animal or anything like that to be able to get the best idea of that situation?
right. Well, so I kind of talked a little bit about like arrested development. Like if you're doing a fecal egg count in the middle of winter, you're probably not going to be seeing as much eggs. So you're going to be wanting to do it kind of like during the time periods that you know that those worms will be active. So I kind of talked a little bit about that arrested development, typically in the spring after, the ewe has lambed or, doe has kidded. They're going to have a suppressed immune system. So they'll get, typically you'll see an increase in the rate of, parasite infection. And then also too later in the summer, when typically the parasites have had a chance to kind of hatch on the pasture and stuff, that's when you will, see more of those problems. So if you're looking at doing a fecal egg count, those are going to be those time periods that you're going to want to try to target. And again, I had that in my PowerPoint, those typical times, but like Melinda said, right away in the beginning, depending on where you're at, your periods of when your worms and parasite problems are probably going to be different, right? So,
Yeah, absolutely. And as a follow-up, speaking kind of on if you're going to be doing just deworming without the fecal counts, you kind of have already touched on that, but that's another question we had there. Is there any parts in the country within the US that you're seeing more barber poleworm compared with other areas?
well, I mean, I'll just put it out there. I'm not a parasitologist, so it's not like I'm working with it in every day, but I know like, kind of in our southern states where it's, in southeastern states, where it's warmer and they have just that ideal conditions for parasites, they're probably seeing more of a challenge than, let's say, you go out west where it's maybe a little bit drier and, don't have as great of a challenge. But I don't follow it enough to like, say, oh, this is, specific pockets or anything, because yeah.
Right. Perfect. I apologize for my delay here. The next question was asking whether we'd be doing a meeting on coccidia, and we don't currently have one scheduled, but we did have one a while back that was really great, that is on our YouTube channel. So our YouTube channel is University of Idaho Extension Livestock. If you want to Google that or look it up on the YouTube channel, but I'm also going to place the link to that specific talk in the chat for everybody, just so you have it. And if that particular video doesn't give you the information that you need, let us know and we'll try to do something else on it as well. But that was a pretty good discussion on coccidia that we had a little while back. There's several people asking about whether slides would be available. Can you pull back up your end slide so they can have your contact info?
Yeah.
So they can just reach out directly to you. If you want slides or more information from Kelly, she'll be happy to share that via email.
You see
And
it?
yes,
Okay.
you just
Perfect.
is there any recommendations or concerns related to deworming right after lambing or kidding? As far as when they're, the lambs and kids are young and drinking off their mothers.
I don't think so. No, no, I never have heard any issues with doing that. So,
Okay. This question has to do with holding animals in holding yards. Can they pick up these parasites at the L2 stage from fecal pellets or soil?
that is a good question. Um, I don't know the exact answer to that. I would say probably not, just from the standpoint they need those ideal conditions to molt into that L3 stage. And I'm just wondering if they ingest soil or fecal pellets that, they're going into an environment that's probably not ideal for them to go into that L3 stage. But I'm not 100% sure on that answer, to be honest.
I think as a general rule, it's definitely possible. Because when animals are in confinement, they're probably ingesting things they shouldn't, or even as they're defecating into feed or whatever you might see. So I would say the answer is could be, but probably not as commonly as out on pasture. Do you have a specific type of microscope or a brand that you recommend for fecal egg counts?
I definitely don't. So my microscope that I have at home, like I honestly, I think I paid $10 for or something. Um, so originally I'm from Minnesota, like the University of Minnesota, they have like a surplus store that they open to the public. And so I just got it um from the surplus store there. But I think so, like I said, most microscopes, if it has a 10x lens, that is good enough, right? To see those eggs. So, I would, look online, see if you can't find a used one or like a lab or something that's closing, or, look at the kids' microscopes, because most of the kids' microscopes, they have a 10x lens on it because it's not a very, sharp, lens that you need to see those eggs. So I don't have a specific brand.
Okay. So you kind of mentioned doing a deworming protocol when you get new animals. There's been a couple of questions related to exposing ewes to rams, and if there's any issue with maybe deworming one and not the other, what would be your protocol there?
Well, if I was bringing in a new animal, I would deworm them right before I introduced them to everybody else, in my flock, right? So theoretically, if you read the books and stuff, we should always be quarantine our new animals, whether or not it gets done. I can definitely say I'm probably guilty of, bringing home animals from the fair and maybe not quarantine them like I should or something like that. But definitely, if you can quarantine them, I would, and I would just automatically treat them. And that's just simply because, like what I was saying, like if they come from a farm that maybe they're not managing their dewormers very well, and they have those resistant worms, that can be brought onto your farm. As far as, deworming one animal and not the other, kind of like I said, that it's okay not to deworm animals if it doesn't need it, right? Because what happens if you deworm one, you don't deworm the other one, hopefully, and this is, a big hopefully, right? The animal that you're not deworming is not going to hopefully have, any, I guess, resistance to that dewormer. So if it passes eggs out on there, and you get a mix of worms on pasture from animals that are dewormed and worms that are not dewormed, the animals consuming those larvae, it's going to be all mixed up in the stomach, right? And hopefully then when they're mating in the stomach, it's not breeding that resistance down. It's kind of diluting that resistance out. So that's kind of my thoughts on it. But
Okay. There is a question about if there's any alternative ways like spraying a pasture or anything like that to control some of these rather than just treating the animal.
That is not an area that I have explored very much. And I mean, there's nothing out there that I have heard of that would probably be cost effective or even just in general effective. So not really that I know of.
Yeah, I think with especially with sheep, it's difficult because most of the pasture treatments are going to have copper in them. And there are ways to do it, but it is not safe for the sheep. So I think as a general rule, raising sheep especially, it becomes pretty difficult to manage the pasture. However, I mean, we can graze more lightly in our pastures, and that will help us not have the same type of parasitism, because when you get down to that last 4 inches of grass is where you're really going to pick up a lot of those internal parasites. And so trying to rotate and give, Kelly talked a lot about the time frame between and how long they need to survive and those types of things, but adding that extra element of not grazing as heavy I think is important when you have a situation with a lot of worms. There is a question about managing with wildlife like white-tailed deer infecting pastures while you're trying to let them rest. I don't know if there's really a great answer for that, but it is something that's an interesting point to make.
Yeah.
And I think there's a couple of questions kind of related to selectivity of, like, say if you're borrowing or renting a ram or buying new stock or anything like that, if there's any way to identify whether they are already carriers or, and I think, Kelly, I'll let you speak to that, but it's just knowing the producer that you're buying them from and being able to have that discussion, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with Melinda on that comment. Just, hopefully you have a relationship if you're borrowing rams and that sort of thing, that you can kind of have that open conversation. Because I mean, without, like, I guess, taking a sample, worming, and then taking another sample and kind of doing that calculation like I showed you, or having a lab do it, it's pretty hard to determine what kind of resistance there is. I think it was University of Georgia. They have a drench right like test that you can like send a fecal sample in, and they can they hatch out the larvae like in the fecal sample, and then they'll actually test different types of dewormers on it. It's pretty expensive though. It's a couple $100. But that is one way that, if I guess you were really wanting to go down that route, that you could test that out too. And that would give you a little bit more information than just kind of a basic like fecal egg reduction count. But
Yeah. And I think I would add too that worms are probably one of the least of your worries when it comes to sharing livestock across farms, especially when it comes to sheep and goats, because there's a lot of potential for disease contamination and that type of thing. So I would encourage you, if you are renting rams or buying new stock or whatever you're doing, to have a very good conversation with that producer, understand their health protocols, make sure they match up with yours, because I mean, there's things that can be brought in other than just worms that could be really detrimental to your flock. And that could be, a sexually transmitted disease, or it could be, foot or the ORF, the
Sore
facial
mouth.
sore mouth. That's what I was looking for. Yeah, so all of those things can be brought in very easily by bringing in animals that you don't know. And so in addition to a worm issue, make sure that you are trusting and knowing where these animals are coming from so that you don't have problems down the road. I'm going to hit one more question and then we'll call it a day. This question is, if you're using bioworma and you're cross grazing with horses, are you better off cycling more frequently between paddocks and returning to the paddock, even if it's under the recommended time frame for that time of year, or graze longer to ensure that your new paddock is considered clean? So I think that's maybe how long do you have to be using bioworma for it to be effective kind of question.
Yeah. I mean, I think bioworm is kind of one of those things you have to like keep feeding it while you have parasite challenge in order for it to be effective. And that's one thing that, maybe on down the line, I talked a little bit how there's a research group on the East Coast who's doing some work, US work, based with bioworma, that maybe once they get to a point where they're willing to share some of their information, that we could have them on and they could talk about all of the stuff that they're doing. Because I know they've been kind of looking at different strategies on how to give it to them so they wouldn't have to feed it, that daily feeding, because that is a huge challenge for somebody who's a pasture-based system to do. So,
right.
But,
Perfect. Well, I want to thank you for all the information. I think it was very informative for the people that were here today. And for those of you that were asking, this discussion will be on our YouTube channel. Again, that's the University of Idaho Extension Livestock channel. And we have a sheep and goat specific set of videos. And thank you so much for joining us today. We are looking forward to seeing you again. Thanks.